My name is Grace Smith. I'm a housing counselor here at the Berkeley Rent Board. I also have Abby Vieira here. She's going to be monitoring the chat and looking at the types of questions that you guys put in, okay? Okay, let's get started. So this is our landlord welcome. It's a welcome to the Berkeley Rent Board. There are a couple things that we are going to go over today. So these are just kind of questions that I hope the presentation answers for you. So why is there rent control? What are we as an agency? What does the rent board offer? What is my responsibility and what do I need to know? So the first one we're going to go into is why is there rent control in Berkeley? So rent control in Berkeley actually started all the way back in 1979. That's when the city council adopted a temporary rent stabilization policy. In 1980, they actually got codified into law. The Berkeley voters passed the Rent Stabilization and Eviction for Good Cause Ordinance. So everything that we talk about kind of goes back to that core ordinance that got passed by the Berkeley voters. Since then, there have been quite a few changes over time. We both to modernize the ordinance and also to expand the coverage. So the main points is the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, which got passed in 1995. That actually limited all rent control jurisdictions within the state of California. So that's a form of decontrol within the state. And then in 2020, Measure MM got passed within the city of Berkeley, and that expanded the coverage. So that created partially covered units. And then Measure BB, which got passed in November of 2024, modernized the ordinance. So whenever we're talking about different pieces of the ordinance or different parts of the municipal code, this is kind of the changes we'll be looking at over time. The rent stabilization ordinance, that's the ordinance that the Berkeley Rent Board gets the jurisdiction from. That's kind of our main focus. But there are multiple other ordinances that you, as a landlord in the city of Berkeley, would want to know about. So here's a list of those ordinances. It's not an all-encompassing list, but just to get an idea of we're not the only requirements. We're not the only agency that has requirements for landlords in the city of Berkeley. There's actually quite a number of agencies. Now, when it comes to the Berkeley Rent Stabilization Ordinance, there are what we call the 4 pillars of rent control. So these are the 4 main pieces of the ordinance. The first is registration. So all rental housing units within the city of Berkeley have to register with the Berkeley Rent Board. There's also a registration fee attached to that. There's differences between the different units, and we'll get into that in the next slide, but just know that the core requirement is that all rental housing units within the city of Berkeley have to register. Next is the actual rent control. So within the Berkeley Rent Stabilization Ordinance, it outlines landlord can only charge up to the rent ceiling for a unit. So how a rent ceiling is calculated is there's the base rent, which is the initial rent charged for a unit, and that stays the same for the first 2 calendar years. And after that, the rent ceiling, it starts increasing by the annual general adjustment, which is 65% of the CPI of the metro area. And that calculation is outlined in the municipal code. Our agency, we calculate it, we put it out in newspapers, newsletters. We try to get it out to you as soon as possible, typically at the end of October, early November for the next year. The next is the just cause to evict. So there are eviction protections. As a landlord, to evict a tenant from a unit that has eviction protections, you have to have the criteria of at least one just cause. So just cause is a list of reasons that you can evict a tenant from the unit. Some of them are at fault, for instance, non-payment of rent, violation of a material lease term. The other ones are not at fault evictions, so those are your owner move-in evictions, your Ellis Act evictions. So those are just a couple, not the complete list. Additionally, there's security deposit interest. So tenants in units within the city of Berkeley are owed back interest on their security deposits each year. That is also a calculation that's written within the municipal code. That is the average of 6 months certificate of deposits of banks doing business in the city of Berkeley. So it's an average of the interest on CDs of banks doing business in the city. Again, we monitor that percentage. We post it on our website. We have it available for you, so you can do the calculation, or you can reach out to us and we can do it for you. So those are our 4 pillars, but not all of these pillars apply to every single unit within the city of Berkeley. So that's where we get into coverage. So the applicability of the ordinance is outlined in Chapter 5. There's 3 types of coverage for units within the city of Berkeley. The first is fully covered. Fully covered units have all 4 pillars of the Berkeley Rent Stabilization Ordinance apply. That means there's eviction protections, security deposit interest, the full registration fee, and there is the rent control. The second is partially covered units. So these units don't have the specific rent control outlined in the ordinance, but every other pillar applies. So that is a partial registration fee. They have security deposit interest still owed back, and they still have eviction protections. The only difference is the rent control outlined in the ordinance does not apply to partially covered units. The next is exempt units. Now, before I said that all units have to register with the Berkeley Rent Board. Once you register a unit, you can then claim an exemption if it's applicable. So if there is an exemption available, you can then claim an exemption. For fully exempt units, none of the pillars of the Berkeley Rent Stabilization Ordinance apply. So there is no rent control outlined in the ordinance. There is no security deposit interest, there are no eviction protections, and you do not have to pay the registration fee. But an exemption is something you claim. So you first have to register, and then claim it. Now, we're going to get into what are we as an agency. So the Berkeley Rent Board kind of refers to 2 separate things. There's the elected board, and then there's the agency itself. The elected board is a governing body of 9 commissioners that are elected by the Berkeley voters, and they oversee the rent stabilization program, enact regulations, and they hear petition appeals that are filed by tenants and landlords. Next, you also have the agency. So that's a city agency that administers and implements the Rent Stabilization and Eviction for Good Cause Ordinance. It's comprised of a total of 7 units that carry out the day-to-day operations. So there's the board itself, and then there's the agency. When it comes to the board, they have board meetings on the 3rd Thursday of the month at 7 p.m. They're open to the public, and they're located in the Berkeley Unified School District boardroom at 1231 Addison Street. I highly, highly, highly recommend attending a board meeting, even if just to go for, the first hour or 2, just to kind of understand what they're talking about, how it works, and also to start building that relationship between you as a landlord in the city of Berkeley and the board members, because they do want to hear from you and your ideas and what resources would help you be a better landlord in the city of Berkeley. Next is getting in contact with the agency, so agency communication. The first thing to note is you can come in person. Our office is located at 2000 Center Street, Suite 400. We're open to the public from 9 a.m. to 4:45 p.m. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. So we are not open to the public on Wednesdays. We still work on Wednesdays, as you can see here. It's just our day to kind of process all the paperwork that we receive from you or process any requests so that we can do it in a timely manner. The next thing to note is that our housing counselors are not available unless an appointment is made ahead of time. They're often scheduled, a week or so in advance, and in order to be able to provide services to the appointments made, we typically are not available if you just drop in. Next is our phone. So we have a main phone line, which is the 510-981-RENT. You can reach counseling if you select extension 1, and you can reach registration if you select extension 2. We also have an email address. So our main email address is therent@berkeleyca.gov. To reach counseling, you can just go through the basic rent@berkeleyca.gov, and then to reach registration, you can contact rentregistry@berkeleyca.gov. And then I know I've been talking a little bit about the difference between contacting counseling and registration, and I'll get into that difference a little bit later on, but just to know that there are ways to get in contact with those units directly. So now, what does the Berkeley Rent Board offer landlords? So there are 4 core services that we offer to landlords. The first is registration. So we have a whole entire registration unit available to help landlords set up their accounts, register their units, and pay the yearly registration fees. We have 5 full-time employees dedicated to helping you with this, trying to get everything updated, accessing your accounts, updating your tenancy information, paying your bill. They're all dedicated to helping you with the registration process to ensure that you are in compliance with the ordinance. Next is counseling. So we have housing counselors available to help landlords understand what rules and regulations apply to their units and get them connected to resources in the area. So one thing to note is, sometimes counselors aren't able to directly answer your questions. So we always try to at least get you connected to a resource that can. The next is mediation. So our office provides mediation services for fully covered and partially covered units. This service allows landlords and tenants to work out disputes with a neutral facilitator present. If you're having, any sort of disputes or issues with your tenants and you want to talk it through, and you feel like this is, a useful service, feel free to reach out and we can set up we can give you the request form and get this started for you, just as a way to kind of help improve the relationship between a landlord and a tenant. Next is petitions. So our office provides petition services to fully covered units in order to adjust the rent level when appropriate. So this is one thing I want to note is that petitions are only available to fully covered units. That is because the Berkeley Rent Board only has jurisdiction over the amount of rent charged for fully covered units. So partially covered units, this is not a service that is available for them. Now, I know one question that a lot of landlords have is like, oh, I can petition for a rent increase. What does that look like? So this is just an example, or this is just a list of landlord petitions. So some of them are like change in space or services, if there has been an increased occupancy, while others aren't necessarily like a formal petition, but they're uh, additional like forms offered by our agency. So that's getting a certificate of the permissible rent level, determining a determination of the exempt status of a rental unit, the determination of the eligibility to set initial rent. So they're not specifically about adjusting the rent level necessarily, more just determining, the coverage, the tenancy information, and then also if you can reset the rent to market rate under Costa-Hawkins. Now, outside of our core services, there are also just general things that the Rent Board tries to provide to landlords in order to help stay in compliance with the ordinance. The first is templates. So we have rent increase notice templates on our website specifically for fully covered units. We have our guide to rent control. We just got a new updated guide with, the layout got adjusted and everything to make it more easier to read. We have landlord resource lists, flyers, email lists, postcards, newsletters, websites, webinars like this, just trying to ensure that all of the information that you need to be successful as a landlord in the city of Berkeley is available as much as possible. Now, when I was talking about the difference between counseling and registration, I know we talked on it a little bit with our core services, but it also leads into our conversation about websites. So the Rent Board has 2 different websites available. The first is our main website, which is the rentboard.berkeleyca.gov. On there, you can see what services we offer, your rights and responsibilities. You can get in contact with the elected board. You can learn more about them. They each have their own email address. You can see when the board meetings are. You have access to all of the rules and regulations. So you can see the municipal code. You can see all of the Berkeley Rent Board regulations. You have access to all of the forms, all the petition forms, all of the registration forms, all of our templates, and then any additional resources. There's also the rent registry. So that's the rentregistry.cityofberkeley.info. So hopefully at this point, everyone here has a login to get into the rent registry. And that is where you would update your tenancy information. You could pay your bill through there. All of your registration requirements can be done through rent registry. So the pro tip is if you have any questions about the website on the left, which is our general Berkeley Rent Board website, go to counseling. But if you have any questions about the rent registry on the right, that's where you go to registration. When in doubt, if you reach out to one of us and you need to go to the other, we work right next to each other, we can just send you over. But it kind of helps make it a little bit faster if you go directly to the unit responsible for the thing that you need to get done. Okay, so what is my responsibility as a landlord? It's really important to know, what are my core responsibilities, to stay in compliance with the ordinance. So there are registration requirements for fully covered units. The vacancy registration form needs to be submitted whenever you have new tenancies, and it has to be filed within 15 days of the start of a new tenancy or 15 days after the last original occupant has departed. Now, one thing I want to highlight is this isn't, an agency policy or like a form that we created that, just helps us do business. This is an actual requirement outlined in the municipal code. So this is where we're trying to make sure you stay in compliance with the rules and regulations outlined in the ordinance. There's also an amended registration statement, which again, hopefully you would have submitted this by now, but it's required for units that have a change in ownership, a new mailing address, or a change in the status of a previously registered unit. That has to be filed within 60 days of the change. And again, this is a requirement outlined in the ordinance. Now, one thing I want to highlight here is that the amended registration statement, it says it's required if there's a change in the status of a previously registered unit. All the way back at the beginning when we were talking about exemptions, not all exemptions are permanent. Some of them are dependent on something else being true at that time. For instance, a golden duplex is an exemption as long as the landlord lives in one of the units. So that's where if that is no longer true, an amended registration statement is needed in order to adjust that registration status. So that's what it's referring to. Now, for partially covered units, you might notice the requirements look the same, but the names of the forms are just different. So, for instance, for partially covered units, a tenancy registration form is required for new tenancies. It still has to be filed within 15 days of the start of a new tenancy or 15 days after the last original occupant has departed. And then for partially covered units, it's called a registration statement for partially covered units. And that is required whenever there's a change of ownership, a new mailing address, or a change in the status of a previously registered unit. And that has to be filed within 60 days of the change. So there's similar requirements between the two. It's just the names of the forms and the forms themselves are different. If you have any questions about that, or you're like, oh no, I have a tenancy, I need to update that, that's where you can reach out to our registration unit and they can help you with all of this. Now, what do I need to know? One thing I really want to highlight is Measure BB. So Measure BB got passed in November of 2024. It's the most recent update to the ordinance. There was a total of 14 changes to the Berkeley Rent Stabilization Ordinance. There are two that I really want to highlight. The first is lease renewals. So tenants refusing to sign a substantially similar lease is no longer a just cause to evict. What happens is, say we're in May ends on the 30th. Let's say we come to May 30th, that was the end of the lease. Come June 1st, due to the Tenant Protection Ordinance, which is another ordinance in the city of Berkeley, you as the landlord are required to accept the rent payment. At that point, due to state law, it converts to a month-to-month tenancy. You cannot evict the tenant because they did not sign a new lease. And this applies to both fully covered units and partially covered units because this is an eviction protection. Next is utilities. So this only affects leases after February 6, 2024. I just want to highlight that because I know the first thing when I talk about this is landlords are like, oh no, I need to fix some things. So this only affects leases that started after February 6th of 2024. For those leases, if a utility is separately metered, the lease must require the tenant to have the utility bill in their name. Typically, this is like PG&E. They normally have a different meter for every single unit. The lease has to require that the tenant has that utility bill in their name if it's separately metered. If the utility is not separately metered, then the cost of the utilities must be included in the base rent, not a separate bill. That's typically, I think, like garbage, sewer, water, where there'll be one bill for a property and that property might have 3 units. So now you, as the landlord, have to anticipate, okay, the garbage bill tends to be this amount every single month. I want to include that cost as part of the rent. So now instead of asking tenants at the start of their tenancy to pay $1,000, I'm going to ask them to pay $1,050 to cover that utility cost. Now, some frequently asked questions. These are like, if there's only 3 things that you left this webinar with, I want you to know these 3 things. The first is, when is the registration fee due? The registration fee is due by July 1st every year. It can be paid online, in person, or by mailing a check. If you do not pay the registration fee on time, it is 100% penalty, and it continues every 6 months after that. So come July 1st, if you do not pay it, it doubles on July 2nd. The next is how is the annual general adjustment calculated? The annual general adjustment, that AGA that the rent ceiling increases by each year, is 65% of the CPI index for the metro area, which is the San Francisco, Oakland, San Jose region. And then how is the security deposit interest rate calculated? That is it is the average of 6 months certificates of deposits by banks doing business in the city.
Just thank you everybody for joining. As Grace said, if you have absolutely any follow-up questions, we'd be happy to answer them by phone, through email, through an appointment, or drop into our counter. We're thrilled to partner with you and make this very complex ordinance feel more manageable, doable, and empower you to have all the information you need to continue to run your property. So thank you for joining us.